There are people we know who seem to shine with a light of their own. They are charming, confident, magnetic. They seem to know exactly who they are and where they are going. When they enter a room, the room changes. When they speak, everyone listens. And yet, something about them doesn't quite fit. There is an emptiness behind that light, a calculated coldness that appears the moment you are no longer useful, a disproportionate rage that emerges when someone dares to contradict them, a strange, almost clinical inability to genuinely care about the pain of others. Perhaps you know someone like this. Perhaps you have been in a relationship with someone like this, and you still wonder how it was possible that someone who seemed to love you so much could treat you as if you had never existed. Or perhaps, at some point, when looking honestly in the mirror, you have recognized some of that in yourself. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung warned that narcissism is not simply a way of loving oneself too much. It is exactly the opposite. It is the inability to see oneself clearly. It is an armor that protects a wound that its wearer cannot even name. It is an image built upon emptiness. Today, we are going to do something uncomfortable. We are going to look directly at the narcissist, without looking away. We are going to descend below the bright surface and find what lies underneath. And in doing so, we will discover that what we find there is not just a portrait of them, but also a mirror of ourselves, of our culture, of our time. Because Jung was right about something that popular psychology tends to forget. There are no monsters. There are only untreated wounds. Development 1. The myth of Narcissus, the trap of the reflection. The story begins, like so many psychological truths in Greek mythology. Narcissus was a young man of extraordinary beauty, son of the river god Cephissus and the nymph Liriope. From the moment of his birth, the seer Tiresias was consulted about the child's destiny. The answer he gave left everyone perplexed. He will live many years if he never knows himself. It was a profound warning that no one knew how to interpret in time, because no one imagined that self-knowledge, that value the Greeks placed above all others, could be a threat to anyone. When Narcissus grew up, his beauty was such that everyone who saw him was immediately spellbound. Men and women, nymphs and mortals, everyone fell in love with him, and they were all rejected with the same impassive coldness. Narcissus lived in a kind of transparent bubble, visible from the outside, impenetrable from the inside. He could be admired, but not touched. He could receive love, but he never returned any. Among those who loved him was the nymph Echo. Echo had a story of her own that needs to be told, because without it, the myth loses half of its richness. Hera, the wife of Zeus, had punished Echo for entertaining her with endless stories and conversations while Zeus escaped with other nymphs. The punishment was precise and terrible. Echo lost the ability to speak on her own initiative. She could only repeat the last words she heard from others. Echo saw Narcissus and fell in love with him. She followed him in silence for days, unable to say anything to him, just waiting for the moment he would speak so she could repeat his words. When that moment finally arrived, when she was able to approach him and repeat his own voice back to him, Narcissus rejected her with contempt. "I would rather die than let you near me," he told her. And Echo, humiliated, retreated to the woods, where she withered away from grief until nothing was left of her but her voice, bouncing eternally across valleys and stones, repeating the last words of others. This is what the narcissist does to those who love them. They turn them into echoes. They empty them of their own voice. They reduce them to surfaces that reflect back their own amplified image. The gods, offended by Echo's suffering and Narcissus's arrogance, took action. They caused the young man to arrive one day, thirsty, at a spring of crystalline water in the middle of a forest. As he leaned down to drink, he saw his own reflection in the water. And here something happened that the Roman poet Ovid narrated in his Metamorphoses with a precision that anticipates centuries of psychology. Narcissus did not know that what he was seeing was his own reflection. Or, if he did know, he couldn't bring himself to care. He was paralyzed by that image. He fell in love with it with the same intensity with which he had previously rejected everyone who loved him. He tried to touch it, and the image dissolved beneath his fingers. He tried to speak to it, and the image moved its lips but made no sound. He tried to kiss it, and found only the cold water. He remained like this for hours, for days, unable to walk away from the spring. Without eating, without sleeping, consumed by a love that could not be reciprocated because the beloved object was not real, until he died of thirst by the water's edge. The myth contains a paradox that Ovid captured in a single sentence: "What I desire, I already have, but my very wealth makes me poor." Narcissus has exactly what he wants: a perfect image, flawless, always available, always beautiful. But that wealth is also his doom, because what he has cannot give him the only thing he needs: a real encounter. Another person to see him and receive him. A voice that is not just the echo of his own. He died looking at his own reflection. He died without having known himself, exactly as Tiresias had prophesied. In the place where he fell, the flower that bears his name sprouted. Beautiful, eternally leaning towards the water, searching for its own reflection. But how many of us live, to a greater or lesser extent, leaning over our own spring? How many of us build a version of ourselves to show the world, and then confuse it with who we really are? How many of us have turned the people who loved us into echoes, without even realizing it? Development 2. Ego inflation. Jung and the collapse of boundaries. Carl Jung did not use the term narcissism as frequently as we do today. He preferred to speak of a more precise and revealing concept: ego inflation. Ego inflation is that state in which the conscious self, the ego, has expanded beyond its natural limits. It has absorbed contents that do not belong to it, qualities of the collective unconscious, powers of archetypal figures, the greatness of the self. It has appropriated all of this as if it were its own, as if it were the source of that greatness, instead of simply its accidental channel. There is a distinction that Jung considered fundamental, and that most people, including those who have read some psychology, tend to confuse. The ego is not the psyche. The ego is only the center of consciousness, the part of our mental life of which we are directly aware. But the psyche is vastly larger than that. The psyche includes the personal unconscious, with all its repressed or simply unexplored contents. It includes the collective unconscious, with all its archetypes and primordial energies. It includes the self, the capital S self, which is the center and totality of the entire psyche, not just the conscious part. When the ego forgets this distinction, when it confuses itself with the self, when it believes itself to be the center of everything instead of just a part, inflation is born. And with inflation, a particular and dangerous blindness is born. The inflated person cannot see their own limits. They cannot see their shadows. They cannot see their wounds. They can only see the greatness they believe they are. Jung was very explicit about the consequences. Ego inflation, he wrote, always produces a blunting of moral perceptions. The person becomes incapable of seeing the harm they cause, because that harm contradicts the image they have of themselves. In other words, the narcissist does not pretend not to see the harm they cause. They genuinely cannot see it. Their psychological architecture makes it impossible. There is something profoundly paradoxical in this, and Jung pointed it out with precision. The person with the most inflated ego is frequently the one who has the poorest contact with their true self, with their real self. Outer grandiosity is inversely proportional to inner self-knowledge. The one who presents themselves as the most secure is, deep down, the one who knows themselves the least. Everything that does not reach consciousness comes back as fate, Jung wrote in one of his most quoted phrases. And this is especially true for the narcissist. Everything they cannot recognize in themselves, everything they reject, everything they deny, everything they attribute to others, returns to them from the outside. It returns in the form of repeating conflicts, in the form of relationships that always end the same way, in the form of patterns that seem like a curse because they are, exactly, a curse. The curse of unconsciousness. The narcissist's shadow does not disappear by being denied. It becomes darker, denser, more autonomous, until one day it explodes. And the narcissist is left looking at the rubble, without understanding how it was possible for everything to collapse, without seeing that it was they themselves who planted every explosive. Development 3. The primal wound, where narcissism comes from. But the question that matters most to us is not what the narcissist does, but why. How is that structure formed? Is someone born a narcissist? Or do they become one? The answer that depth psychology has elaborated over decades is unequivocal. At the origin of the narcissistic structure, there is always a wound. An early wound, proverbial in many cases, that took place in the most vulnerable context of all. Childhood. The psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut, whose work in the 70s and 80s transformed the clinical understanding of narcissism, proposed that pathological narcissism is not the result of an excess of self-love, but of a profound and specific lack of it. Not love in a generic sense, but a particular kind of love. The love that sees and reflects the real child. Kohut called this process the empathetic mirror. In the first years of life, the child needs their caregivers to reflect back an accurate and loving image of who they are. They need their emotions to be seen, named, and validated. They need their achievements to be celebrated with genuine joy. They need to feel that the adult in front of them is truly present, truly interested, truly there. When that mirror works well, when the adult can be present consistently enough, the child develops what Kohut called a cohesive and stable self-structure. They learn, on the deepest possible level, that their real self is enough. That they do not need to be different from who they are to deserve love. But when the mirror fails, when the caregivers cannot see the real child because they are too busy with their own pain, or because they need the child to be a particular way to satisfy their own needs, or because they are narcissists themselves and cannot see anything that is not a reflection of themselves, the child learns something devastating. They learn that their real self is not enough. That in order to be loved, to be safe, to be visible, they must construct another self. A presentable, performative self, adapted to what the adults need to see. And so the armor is born, a carefully constructed, polished, and exhibited image of oneself. A false self that promises conditional love and that hides, with increasingly deeper layers, the real self. That wounded, ashamed self, convinced that if anyone were to see them as they truly are, they would be abandoned. That is why the adult narcissist cannot take criticism. Not because they are arrogant, even if they seem to be, but because any criticism, no matter how small, threatens to demolish the only structure that protects them from their oldest wound. The criticism does not reach the inflated ego. The criticism pierces through all the layers of grandiosity and goes straight to the child who once, in the most vulnerable moment of their life, was not enough. The Jungian analyst James Hollis writes, "Narcissism is not a problem of an excess of self-love, but of the absence of a genuine encounter with the deepest self." The narcissist has not yet found themselves. They have only found their image. and they confuse that image with their identity, because no one, at the time when it mattered, showed them that there was something more. This is the cruelest irony of narcissism. The one who most needs to be seen is the one who can least tolerate being truly seen. Development 4. The picture of Dorian Gray, the shadow that grows in the attic. Few works of Western literature have captured the psychology of narcissism with as much precision as Oscar Wilde's 1890 novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Wilde, who experienced firsthand the fascination and destruction that accompany the pursuit of beauty and admiration, created something with this novel that transcends literature, a psychological map of the narcissistic soul. Dorian Gray is a young man of extraordinary beauty who, upon contemplating the portrait painted of him by Basil Hallward, has a disturbing revelation. The painting is perfect. The painting is eternal. But he, Dorian, will grow old. He will lose his beauty. He will wither away. Faced with this prospect, he makes a wish that the story mysteriously fulfills, that the painting should grow old while he remains eternally young. His wish comes true. From that moment on, Dorian lives on the radical surface. He pursues unrestricted pleasure, seduces and abandons without remorse, lies, manipulates, and destroys. Every act of cruelty, every lie, every betrayal costs him absolutely nothing. He never ages. His face remains smooth, beautiful, and imperturbable. People look at him and see innocence. They see what he chooses to show them. But the painting, hidden under lock and key in the attic of his mansion, accumulates all the marks of his real life. Every cruelty leaves a wrinkle. Every lie adds a shadow. Every act of destruction makes it a little more monstrous. The painting progressively transforms into a horror that Dorian cannot look at without feeling a terror he cannot name. From a Jungian perspective, the reading of this novel is almost perfect in its clarity. The painting is Dorian's shadow. It is the accumulation of everything he cannot recognize in himself. Everything he has rejected, repressed, and attributed to others. Everything he has unconsciously and unworthily handed over to the dark side of the scale. The shadow, as always in Jung, does not disappear. It grows. It accumulates. It becomes increasingly autonomous and dangerous. And here Wilde adds an element that psychology has taken a long time to understand. A denied shadow does not just become darker. It eventually demands to be seen. There is a point in the novel where Dorian cannot enter the attic without experiencing something akin to terror. The painting calls to him. Because the shadow always calls. It always seeks integration, even if in the most brutal way possible. At the end of the novel, Dorian can bear it no longer. He destroys the painting with a knife. And in doing so, in attempting to destroy his shadow, he destroys himself. The servants who arrive at the sound of the scream find a deformed, dead old man in the attic whom they barely recognize as their master. Meanwhile, the painting, intact, once again displays the original beauty of the young Dorian. Jung would have recognized a fundamental psychological truth in this outcome. The shadow cannot be destroyed. It can only be integrated. Trying to eliminate the darkness instead of illuminating it only darkens the one who tries. There is no light without shadow, Jung wrote, and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. Dorian lived without a visible shadow. And that is why, in the end, nothing of him remained. What portrait is growing in the attic of each of us, while we continue to show the world only the version of ourselves that we deem presentable? Development 5. The two faces of narcissism, the grandiose and the vulnerable. Contemporary clinical psychology has identified two main presentations of narcissism that, at first glance, seem to be opposites, but share exactly the same root. The grandiose narcissist is the one we immediately imagine when we think of narcissism: dominant, self-assured, exhibitionist, with an obvious need for admiration. They take up conversational space. They speak about themselves with an ease that can be fascinating before becoming exhausting. They feel they deserve special treatment and become visibly irritated when they do not receive it. They do not empathize with others, not because they are necessarily cruel by nature, but because they genuinely do not perceive them as beings with an inner life comparable to their own. Others are characters in their story, not protagonists of their own. But there is also the vulnerable narcissist, who is much harder to recognize and who, precisely for that reason, can cause as much or more damage in relationships. This narcissist is shy, withdrawn, and hypersensitive to any form of criticism or rejection. They feel chronically and secretly special, misunderstood, and not valued as they deserve. Their grandiosity is internal and covert, almost never expressed, but no less intense than that of the grandiose narcissist. They move comfortably in the role of the victim. They can evoke compassion with a mastery that is frequently unconscious. And they have the same essential inability to see the other as an autonomous subject. What both share, beneath all their surface differences, is the same fundamental wound and the same basic defense mechanism: the inability to relate to others as complete beings in themselves. For both, others exist fundamentally in relation to themselves, whether as an audience that must admire them, as a threat that must be neutralized, or as a source of validation that must be utilized while it lasts. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, in his work I and Thou, described two fundamental modes of relating to reality. In the I-Thou relationship, the other is encountered as a complete, irreducible, mysterious being, with an inner life that the I cannot control or possess, but can recognize and honor. In the I-It relationship, the other is treated as an object, as a thing, as a means to an end, as something that exists to be used, evaluated, discarded. The narcissist, in both of their forms, lives fundamentally in the I-It mode. They cannot find the Thou because they never learned, at the time it should have been learned, that the Thou exists. That there is something on the other side of the mirror that is not a reflection. And here is the irony that Jung pointed out insistently. Precisely because the narcissist cannot see the other, they also cannot truly see themselves. The I and the Thou are built mutually, in relationship. Without the genuine encounter with the other, the true self remains in darkness, unknown even to the one who inhabits it. The narcissist, paradoxically, is the one who knows themselves the least. Their image deceives them before it deceives anyone else. Development 6. Projection and the cycles of narcissistic relationships. One of the most characteristic manifestations of narcissistic psychology, and one of the most devastating for those around them, is the mechanism of projection. Jung described projection as the process by which one unconsciously attributes to others precisely those contents of one's own psyche that one cannot recognize or tolerate in oneself. When we project, we see in the other the content of our own shadow, those traits, impulses, emotions, and qualities that we have excluded from our conscious self-image. Projection is always an act of unconsciousness. As long as it remains active, the projected content cannot be integrated. It cannot be examined, questioned, or transformed. It remains on the outside, attaching itself to the people around us as if it were their natural property, not ours. The narcissist projects with an efficiency that can be disorienting for the one receiving it. They project their envy onto those they envy, accusing them of being the envious ones. They project their emptiness onto those around them, describing them as superficial and incapable. They project their need for control onto those who ask for boundaries, treating them as manipulative. They project their own inability to love onto those who pull away out of exhaustion, blaming them for not having loved them enough. And there is yet another level of projection that is harder to see. The narcissist also projects their unrecognized grandiosity. They approach people they perceive as exceptional, brilliant, and capable, not to genuinely admire them as subjects distinct from themselves, but to appropriate their brilliance, to incorporate it into their own image. In psychological terms, this is known as identification with the idealized object. The narcissist needs to be close to what they perceive as grandiose, because that makes them grandiose by association. This explains the devastating cycles that characterize relationships with narcissistic people, which those who have lived through them recognize with painful accuracy. The first phase is idealization. The narcissist, at the beginning of a relationship, can be the most attentive, charming, and passionate human being anyone has ever met. They make the other person feel completely seen, completely special, completely loved. This is not necessarily consciously calculated. The narcissist genuinely idealizes at the beginning, because the other has not yet made the mistake of showing themselves to be human. The second phase is devaluation. At some inevitable point, the other commits the crime of having their own needs, of having a bad day, of not being able to be always available, of not admiring unconditionally. At that moment, the other stops serving as a perfect mirror, and the narcissist, who had no access to any other kind of relationship, begins to devalue. What was once brilliant is now mediocre. What was once unique is now common. The other feels the fall without understanding exactly why it happened. The third phase is abandonment or expulsion. Once the other has been devalued, the narcissist discards them, replaces them, or makes them responsible for everything that has gone wrong. And in many cases, the cycle begins again with someone new, who will soon be idealized with the same intensity. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, observed that in the dreams of people with narcissistic structures, a recurring image frequently appears. A figure looking at themselves in a mirror, unable to look away, even if the figure in the mirror has begun to show something distorted or monstrous. The dream points out, with the precision that only the unconscious can achieve, the exact point where contact with reality has been severed. The mirror has replaced life. And as long as this is so, life cannot begin. Development 7. Collective narcissism, the shadow of our time. Jung went further than the individual, much further. He warned, with a clarity that is prophetic for those reading his writings today, that ego inflation is not just a personal phenomenon. It is also, and perhaps more dangerously, a collective phenomenon. Nations, religious groups, ideologies, social movements, and institutions can inflate their collective ego in exactly the same way an individual does. And they can do so with the same consequences. Blindness to their own shadow, projection of that shadow onto those perceived as others, and eventually, when the tension can no longer be sustained, an explosion. The greatest evil that can happen to humanity does not come from disturbed individuals, but from normal people who identify completely with the perspective of their group. Jung wrote in a text published shortly after the Second World War. The philosopher and psychologist Erich Fromm, who had been a disciple of Freud and shared with Jung a central concern for the psychology of collective evil, spoke in this regard of group narcissism, that phenomenon by which the members of a collective identify so completely with it that any criticism of the group is experienced as a personal attack. The grandiosity of the group becomes the grandiosity of each of its members. The shadow of the group becomes the shadow that each member individually denies. The intensity of group narcissism, Fromm wrote in The Heart of Man, is proportional to the lack of real individual achievements and personal dignity in daily life. Those who have nothing to be proud of individually take pride in belonging to whatever: their nation, their race, their religion, their football team. Jung also pointed out something that is especially relevant in our historical moment, that times of great social and cultural disruption are particularly conducive to collective narcissistic inflation. When traditional structures of meaning collapse, when the individual feels small and powerless in the face of forces they do not understand, the temptation to identify with something great and powerful becomes almost irresistible. And that something can be a nation, an ideology, a charismatic leader, or a movement, and what is happening in our time. Social media networks have created infrastructures of unprecedented efficiency for the expression and amplification of narcissism, both individual and collective. Not in the simplistic sense that social media creates narcissists where they did not exist before, but in the sense that they normalize and reinforce narcissistic mechanisms: the obsessive curation of one's own image, the compulsive search for external validation in the form of measurable numbers, the reduction of the other to a unit of interaction, the profound confusion between identity and audience, between who we are and how many follow us. Jung would have recognized in the act of posting a photo and anxiously waiting for the first comments a modern, perfectly mechanical, and scalable version of Narcissus leaning over the spring. The digital reflection is brighter, more instantaneous, and more addictive than any pool of water. But it is still a reflection, and the reflection, by definition, can never love back. The question that Jungian psychology poses, and that our era seems reluctant to examine, is this: what psychological price are we collectively paying for living in a culture that has built its most powerful infrastructures upon the foundation of narcissism? What collective shadow are we feeding while we look at our phones? Development 8. Narcissism in Literature. Humbert and the confusion between projection and love. Perhaps the most disturbing example of narcissism in 20th century literature is not a broadly drawn villain, but precisely the opposite: a seductive, cultured, eloquent narrator, capable of making the reader feel, for a few pages, something akin to sympathy. Humbert, the protagonist of Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, published in 1955, is a man obsessed with a 12-year-old girl, Dolores Hayes, whom he calls Lolita. The novel is narrated in the first person by Humbert himself, and that is exactly its psychological trap. What we read is not Lolita's story. It is Humbert's story about Lolita. The voice of the real girl is completely absent from the text, replaced by Humbert's narcissistic projection. Because Lolita, Humbert's Lolita, is not a person, she is a construct, a fantasy, a projection of contents from his own unconscious that he has placed onto a real girl. He calls her a nymphid, attributes superhuman powers of seduction to her, and sees her as the object of a tragic and sublime love. All of this while the real girl, Dolores Hayes, lives a horror that Humbert cannot and will not see, because seeing it would destroy the image. Nabokov constructed the novel with an almost clinical precision. Whoever reads closely can see, beneath Humbert's seductive voice, the flashes of reality that he constantly suppresses. The girl cries at night. The girl asks to be returned to her life. The girl, at a certain point, disappears from the story precisely because Humbert cannot continue looking at her without seeing what he has done. Jung would have read this novel as a case study in narcissistic projection. Humbert does not love Lolita. He loves his own projection onto Lolita. And as long as that projection remains active, Lolita as a real person cannot exist in his perception. She is obliterated by the content he deposits onto her. This is the mechanism by which narcissism in relationships erases the other. Not always in such an extreme or criminal way as in Humbert's case, frequently in much more everyday and invisible ways, when we love not the real person we have in front of us, but the image we have of them. When we expect the other to be a certain way and become frustrated when they inevitably are not. When we idealize only to be disappointed later and blame the other for the disappointment. What we project onto the other, Jung wrote, is always a content of our own psyche, and as long as it remains projected, we cannot relate to the other nor to that content. Only when we withdraw the projection, when we recognize it as our own, can the real encounter begin. The real encounter. That which Narcissus could never have. That which Humbert never wanted. Development 9. Is there a cure? The path of individuation. We now arrive at the question that perhaps no one dares to ask out loud. Can the narcissist change? Psychology has nuanced answers to this question, and honesty compels us to present them without romanticizing them. The deep narcissistic structure is one of the most difficult to transform from a therapeutic point of view, not because the narcissist is intrinsically incapable of change, but for reasons that have a perfect internal logic. A person with a deep narcissistic structure rarely seeks help of their own free will. Their armor tells them that the problem is always on the outside, that if something doesn't work, it's because others are not up to par. The narcissist comes to therapy, when they do come, generally pushed by a crisis that they can no longer project with sufficient efficiency. The collapse of a relationship that genuinely mattered to them. A loss of status that confronts them with their fragility. A depression that does not respond to any external achievement because the emptiness that generates it is internal. And at that moment, in that moment of crisis that the narcissist experiences as an existential threat, if there is enough courage, if there is a competent therapist, if there is something in the true self, buried under decades of armor, that still wants to live in a real way, something possible can begin. Jung called this process individuation, the movement towards the wholeness of the personality, which necessarily requires the confrontation and integration of the shadow. For the narcissist, this means something very specific and very concrete, learning, perhaps for the first time in their life, to tolerate their own imperfection without the world collapsing, to receive criticism without it being a death sentence, to recognize the harm caused without having to deny or rationalize it, to discover, with a surprise that can be genuinely transformative, that beneath the armor there is a self that is more interesting, more complex, and more capable of real love than the armor would have ever allowed. The Jungian analyst Murray Stein observes that the individuation process in people with narcissistic structures invariably begins with a moment of what the Greeks called kenosis, an emptying. Not an emptying of identity, but of the false image that has taken the place of identity for so long. A moment when the person can say, even if only in private, even if only to themselves, this thing I have been presenting to the world is not me. That moment is terrifying. It is the moment when Narcissus should have looked away from the spring. And many narcissists cannot get through it. The armor is too thick. The fear of what lies beneath is too intense. But some can. And in those cases, what Jung described is something that could be called nothing less than a second birth, the emergence of the true self, with all its fragility and all its capacity for genuine contact with reality. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke expressed it with a lasting image. Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with courage. The narcissist's wound, that primal wound that led them to build the armor, is also their door. It is not their doom. It is their possibility. Development 10. the narcissism within us. And we arrive now at the most uncomfortable moment of this exploration. The moment that, if we have made it this far, we already knew was coming. Jung taught, with a consistency he never abandoned, that there is no psychological trait, however dark or disturbing it may be, that does not exist to some extent in each of us. Archetypes are not the properties of a few exceptional or particularly damaged individuals. They are dimensions of the human psyche. We all inhabit them in different proportions at different times, with different levels of awareness. The question, then, is not whether we carry something of the narcissist inside. The question is to what extent that aspect is integrated or projected, conscious or unconscious, acknowledged or denied. We have all had moments when we could not listen to a criticism without getting defensive. Moments when we used someone as a mirror to confirm our own image. Moments when another person's pain was filtered through our own need, and we used it without knowing it. Moments when we idealized someone only to be disappointed by their humanity, as if the problem were theirs. Moments when we leaned over the spring. The difference between pathological narcissism and the narcissistic traits we all share is not one of nature, but of degree and rigidity. Pathological narcissism is an armor that cannot be taken off, even when there is no longer any danger. Narcissistic traits in more psychologically integrated people are mechanisms that appear under pressure, but that can be recognized, named, and transformed when there is enough inner light. And that inner light, that recognition, is not achieved through self-flagellation or humiliation. Jung was very clear about this. The antidote to narcissism is not self-loathing, which is simply inverted narcissism. The antidote is genuine self-knowledge, the honest encounter with the totality of who one is, with the lights and the shadows, with the ego that wants to shine, and the self that simply wants to be real. The person who makes their shadow conscious, Jung wrote, has given themselves the greatest gift they can give themselves. And in doing so, they also give it to others. Because the narcissist's shadow does not only affect the narcissist, it affects everyone around them. Those who were their echo, like Echo in the myth, who wasted away until they lost their own voice. Those who learned not to have needs of their own, so as not to disturb them. Those who grew up believing that love always comes with conditions, with costs, with the permanent threat of abandonment. Doing shadow work, recognizing one's own narcissistic traits instead of projecting them outward, is one of the most concrete and transformative forms of reparation that exists. Let us return to the myth, but now with different eyes. When Narcissus leans over the spring and sees his reflection, there is a moment in Ovid's tale that is frequently overlooked. A moment of terrible lucidity that the poet captures with a breathtaking brevity. At some point in his contemplation, Narcissus begins to suspect. He begins to intuit, with an anguish that grows like the water that ripples when he tries to touch the image, that something about this love is fundamentally impossible. That the beauty he contemplates cannot reciprocate. That he is alone, face to face with something that is not a being, but an appearance. And Ovid writes, "What I desire, I already have, but my very wealth makes me poor." Narcissus understands. In the end, on the very brink of death, Narcissus understands that what he loves is not another being. It is his own image. And that realization, which comes too late to save him in the myth, is exactly the realization that can save us in real life. Recognizing when we are in love with our image instead of our reality. Recognizing when the mirror has replaced the encounter. Recognizing when the armor we built to survive has become, over time, our prison. Tiresias's prophecy at the beginning of the myth deserves to be carefully revisited. Narcissus will live many years if he never knows himself. In the myth, the self-knowledge that destroys Narcissus is the recognition of his image in the water. That surface-level self-knowledge that confirms outward beauty but does not descend to any depth. Tiresias was not talking about true self-knowledge. He was warning about false self-knowledge, about the moment when one sees oneself in the reflection and believes they have reached the bottom. Genuine self-knowledge, the kind Jung pursued throughout all his work, is not seeing one's own image in the water. It is descending beneath the water. It is finding in the depths not a reflection, but a reality. Not an appearance, but a being. Not a mirror, but a self. And that descent is always, without exception, a descent into the shadow. Into everything we have rejected, denied, projected, into the original wound, to the child who one day was not enough, and who has been waiting decades to be found. Beneath the surface, there is no reflection. There is depth, there is shadow, there is gold, and there is, waiting with the patience of that which has never been in a rush, something that has never been an image, the real self, the one who can love and be loved, the one who can see the other and be seen, the one who can say, without armor and without fear, "Here I am." This is perhaps the most demanding topic we have explored together on this channel. Because looking at the narcissist with honesty, true honesty, inevitably requires that we also look at ourselves. Before you close this video, just one question. In what part of your life are you looking at a reflection, when you could be looking at reality? Is there a relationship, some aspect of yourself, some repeated pattern that might be telling you something you are not yet ready to hear? Tell us in the comments. There is no right answer. It is not a trap. It is the same question that depth psychology has been asking for centuries. Who are you when no one is watching? Those who make it to this point in the video already know that inner work does not end with any video. But every honest exploration, every moment of genuine recognition is a real step in the individuation process that Jung described as the task of a lifetime. In the next video, we are going to explore the other side of this same coin, the psychology of evil, and what Jung discovered about our collective capacity to turn the personal shadow into collective destruction. If this video made you think, the next one is going to make you uncomfortable in a different way. And on this channel, that is always a good sign.